The billionaire ordered his friend to give him the heir that would save his empire. She was a virgin and said yes, not knowing how deeply that man would mark her forever. Now he's ready to sacrifice everything to never lose her again. If you love love stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and comment where you're listening from. Let's keep going. Rose grew up among the rows of vines that stretched across the hills of Sonoma Valley, running barefoot through the red, dry earth of Northern California, while the warm Pacific breeze tossed her light brown hair. She was always that invisible girl with honey-colored eyes who dreamed silently while sitting on oak barrels in the winery, hearing from afar the laughter of the group of rich boys who came from San Francisco during vacations. Among them, Nathan Blackwell, heir to the largest wine empire in the region. The Blackwell family had arrived in the valley decades ago when the Portuguese patriarch decided to invest in wine production in California, taking advantage of the unique microclimate of the region. What began as a bold project transformed into an empire that dominated not only grape production, but also luxury hotels, restaurants, and even a small airline company. Nathan was the prince of this kingdom of wealth and prestige, while Rose was merely the granddaughter of the former winemaker who had lost his own family vineyard to debt years before. He only noticed her when he needed answers for literature, assignments from the private school where he studied when he was in the region. But he never realized how much she looked at him like someone contemplating a sunset in the valley. Unreachable, intense, dangerously beautiful. Nathan had those dark eyes, typical of Portuguese descendants, skin golden from the California sun, and a smile that made the girls in town sigh. To him, Rose was just a studious girl who helped him with English and history, nothing more. Years later, now 27, Rose lived in Los Angeles, in a tiny apartment in Silver Lake, working as a viticulture researcher at UCLA while finishing her doctorate. Her research grants barely covered rent and food, and she was too busy with dissertations and financial worries to think about love or relationships. She kept her virginity not out of religious morality, but from a deep fear of giving something so intimate to someone who would abandon her afterward, as everyone had done in her life since her parents' death. Her days were limited to the library, the laboratory, and lonely nights studying theories about fermentation and chemical soil analysis. Sometimes she received WhatsApp messages from old friends from Sonoma showing their glamorous lives on Instagram, pompous weddings, trips to Miami, imported cars. Rose would just like the photos and return to her books, pretending she didn't feel a pang of envy mixed with loneliness. It was on one of those rainy March nights, when she had finally managed to fall asleep after hours of writing about the particularities of American terroir, that someone knocked on her door at 3 in the morning. The noise was insistent, desperate, and she woke up with her heart racing. Los Angeles in the early morning was no place to open doors without knowing who was on the other side. Through the window, she saw a male figure leaning against the wall of the corridor, wet from the rain that entered through the broken skylight of the old building. When she recognized Nathan, her knees trembled. 8 years had passed since the last time they saw each other, but she would recognize that silhouette anywhere in the world. He was taller, broader, the thick beard making his face seem more mature and angular. He wore an expensive suit completely. Soaked, dark hair stuck to his forehead, and his eyes had an expression she had never seen before, pure desperation. Rose opened the door with trembling hands, wearing only a thin nightgown and a worn bathrobe. Nathan looked her up and down, as if confirming that she was really there, alive, real. He didn't say a word in the first few minutes. He just entered, closed the door behind him, and sat on the floor, leaning against the cold wall of the apartment corridor, breathing heavily as if he had run for miles. The silence was deafening. Rose stood, hugging herself, smelling his familiar scent mixed with the odor of rain and desperation. It was the same expensive cologne he used as a teenager, but now there was something more. Something that smelled of expensive whiskey and sleepless nights. She wanted to ask 1,000 things, scream, cry, hug him, throw him out, but she just stood there waiting, as she had always done in his presence. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable, carrying a California accent that he had lost in his years living between Los Angeles, New York, and London. but which returned in moments of extreme emotional tension. He told everything without beating around the bush, like someone confessing a heinous crime. He was about to lose all his inheritance, the entire empire that his family had built over decades in the Sonoma Valley. His grandfather's will contained archaic clauses, typical of traditional European families. Nathan had to produce a legitimate heir before turning 30, or the entire fortune would automatically pass to Jeremy, his younger brother. And Jeremy was everything a respectable family feared having as a representative, involved with human trafficking, exploitation of slave labor on family farms, money laundering through shell companies, and something even worse that Nathan couldn't speak aloud, but that Rose perceived in his eyes: sexual violence. Nathan had lied to everyone for years, saying he was infertile due to an infection contracted on a trip to Africa, but the truth was much more complex and painful. At 22, in a crisis of rebellion against his controlling father, who wanted to turn him into a reproduction machine to perpetuate the family lineage, he had secretly undergone a vasectomy at a private clinic in Los Angeles. It was an act of juvenile desperation, a way to regain control over his own body and future. Now, however, he was living a merciless dilemma that consumed him day and night. There was still time to reverse the surgery, but the procedure was complex, expensive, and didn't guarantee total success. More importantly, he needed someone trustworthy, someone who would never betray him, someone who wouldn't denounce the secret of the vasectomy or try to blackmail the family afterward. Jeremy had spies everywhere, people willing to sell any information for money, and if he discovered the truth about Nathan's feigned infertility, he would use it to accelerate the inheritance transfer process. Rose listened to everything in silence, sitting on the floor of the corridor next to him, feeling the world spin around her. Part of her wanted to laugh at the irony. The rich boy who had never noticed her as a woman was now there, desperate, needing her in a way he had never imagined possible. Another part felt a mixture of fear and excitement that deeply frightened her. The proposal Nathan made was clear and brutal, like a punch to the stomach. He would give her all the money necessary to buy back her grandfather's failed vineyard, which had been auctioned years before and now belonged to a Los Angeles businessman who used it only as a country house. Additionally, he would guarantee lifelong financial comfort for her, an apartment in any city she chose, a car, health insurance, anything she wanted, but he needed her body that very night. It wasn't love, it wasn't romance, it was a cold and calculated commercial transaction. He would do the fertility tests on her right there, using a kit he had brought in his car trunk, would attempt conception immediately, and then travel to Switzerland, where he would have vasectomy reversal surgery at a specialized clinic. If she got pregnant that night, perfect. If not, he would try again after the surgery, but time was running out quickly. Rose felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Fear, shame, repressed desire, anger, and a strange feeling of importance consumed her simultaneously. For the first time in her life, someone wanted her as a woman, not for a romantic relationship or a casual adventure, but for something visceral, primitive, definitive. It was an urgent biological necessity, yes, but it was also her, specifically. Her, whom he had chosen among all the women in the world. Nathan coldly explained why he had thought of her. Rose was socially invisible, had no family to make a scandal, had no money to hire expensive lawyers, had no contacts in the media to sell the story. More importantly, she had been in love with him as a teenager, which meant she would never intentionally hurt him. He had noticed the way she looked at him years ago, even though he was too young to fully understand what it meant. His words hurt like sharp blades, but Rose couldn't deny that there was a cruel and perfect logic in that choice. She really was the ideal candidate for such a sordid transaction, invisible, vulnerable, financially desperate, and still emotionally connected to him in a way that even she didn't fully understand. It was humiliating and exciting at the same time, as if her entire life had been a preparation for this absurd and inevitable moment. Rose didn't respond immediately. She sat there on the cold floor of the corridor, hugging her knees, while Nathan waited in silence. The rain continued to beat on the broken skylight, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to mark the time of a decision that would change her life forever. She thought about her grandfather's vineyard, those oak barrels where she used to hide to read, the smell of fermented grapes that still visited her dreams, the feeling of belonging somewhere that she had lost when the creditors took everything away. She also thought about the loneliness that had consumed her for years, the relationships that never happened because she always sabotaged herself before completely surrendering, the constant fear of being abandoned that made her build insurmountable walls around her heart. Nathan was offering a bizarre form of freedom, financial freedom, freedom from the past, and perhaps even freedom from the fear of being touched by someone who would later disappear, because in this case, she already knew from the beginning that he would leave. When she finally spoke, her voice came out in a trembling whisper. "If I agree, do you promise that you'll leave afterward and never appear in my life again? Never look for the child if there is one?" Nathan closed his eyes and nodded slowly, but she noticed a shadow of hesitation cross his face. "I promise," he said. But the words sounded hollow, like a lie he was telling himself. They left Los Angeles in his black BMW still before dawn, driving in silence on the empty roads toward Northern California. Nathan had reserved a private flight that would take them directly to the Santa Rosa airport, because they couldn't risk being seen together in commercial airports. During the flight, Rose stayed glued to the window, watching the city lights disappear and give way to the darkness of the valley, while Nathan worked on his laptop, making calls in English to Swiss doctors and international lawyers. Her family's old vineyard was 40 miles from Santa Rosa, on a dirt road that snaked between the dry hills and the oak trees. The place had been abandoned for more than 10 years since the last caretaker couple had left. Nathan drove slowly down the potholed road, the car's headlights illuminating the dried vegetation and the remains of a rusty sign that still said Pleasant Ridge Winery, founded in 1952. When they arrived, Rose felt her chest tighten. The main house had broken windows, was overrun with weeds. The colonial tiles cracked, letting the rain in and rotting the wooden beams. But the warehouse where the barrels were kept was still standing, imposing against the starry sky of the valley. Nathan parked right in front of the main door and spent a few minutes just looking at the building, as if calculating something in his head. "No one will find us here," he said, more to himself than to her. "My brother doesn't even know this place exists, and even if he did, he would never think to look here." He turned off the engine and turned to her. "Are you sure you want to do this? Because once it starts, there's no going back." Rose nodded, but her hands were shaking when she opened the car door. The smell of the valley invaded her lungs, dry earth, oak, old moisture, and something indefinable that smelled of lost memories. Nathan took a suitcase from the trunk, and they walked together to the warehouse door. He forced the rusty lock with a screwdriver he had brought from the city, and the door yielded with a metallic groan. The interior was exactly as Rose remembered, only covered by a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The oak barrels remained aligned, in perfect rows, some cracked, others still intact, all empty for so long that the silence seemed to have turned solid. Nathan lit an improvised fire in the center of the main hall, using dry branches and newspaper he found scattered on the floor. The light of the flames danced on the stone walls, creating ghostly shadows that seemed to be mute witnesses to what was about to happen. Rose sat on a wooden bench near the fire, watching Nathan meticulously prepare the medical materials he had brought: syringes, test tubes, a small portable microscope, hormone pills in expensive pharmaceutical packages. "It's now," he said, without looking at her. His voice was different, deeper, carrying a tension she had never heard before. "If you've changed your mind, this is your last chance to say no." Rose couldn't answer. She just sat there on the wooden bench, watching the flames dance and project ancient shadows on the stone walls of the winery. The smell of smoke mixed with the odor of old wood, dry earth, and something deeper, more primitive, that seemed to come from the very stones of the place. Nathan finished organizing the medical materials on an improvised table made of old boards supported by barrels, his movements precise and clinical, as if he were preparing for surgery. When he approached, Rose felt her entire body tremble. It wasn't exactly fear, but a complex mixture of anticipation, terror, and a desire that she had buried for so long that she didn't even know it existed anymore. Nathan stopped in front of her, extended his hand, and when she took it, his fingers were ice-cold despite the heat of the fire. He helped her stand up and guided her to a pile of thick blankets that he had spread near the fire. There was no romance in the gesture, only a careful efficiency that made everything even more real and frightening. "We need to do the tests first," he said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended, "to make sure you're ovulating." The tests were clinical, cold, humiliating in a way that Rose hadn't anticipated. Nathan used surgical gloves and took care to explain each procedure, as if they were doctor and patient, not two people about to cross a line they could never undo. When he finished, he analyzed the samples in the portable microscope while she composed herself, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that went far beyond the physical. "It's perfect," he announced after a few minutes, putting away the equipment. "Your cycle is at its peak. If it's going to happen, it will be today." There was something in his voice that she couldn't identify. Relief, perhaps, or fear, or both. He turned to her, and for the first time since they had arrived, he really looked her in the eyes. "Rose, I need you to know that—" "No," she interrupted him, raising her hand. "Don't say anything romantic. Don't ruin this by pretending it's something other than what it really is." Her words came out harsher than she intended, but she knew that if he started talking about feelings, she would lose the courage to continue. Nathan nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. There was something there that she couldn't completely decipher, perhaps anticipated regret, perhaps guilt that he hadn't yet processed. He took off his shirt slowly, revealing a broad chest, muscles defined by expensive gym workouts, a small scar near his heart that she didn't remember seeing when they were younger. When it was her turn to undress, Rose felt a wave of insecurity that almost paralyzed her. Her body wasn't like those of the women he was certainly used to. It was thinner, more angular, marked by years of financial worries and irregular eating. But Nathan looked at her with an intensity that made her forget her own imperfections. He kissed her without sweetness, his lips hard and hot against hers, which were cold and trembling. There was no attempt at seduction or romantic preliminaries. It was a kiss of possession, of right acquired by the transaction they had agreed upon. But when she began to cry silently, feeling the salty taste of her own tears mix with his, Nathan stopped and rested his forehead against hers. "I can't do this if you're crying," he whispered, and for the first time his voice came out vulnerable, almost broken. "Please don't cry." Rose wiped her face with the back of her hand and pulled him closer. "I'm not crying from sadness," she lied, because she didn't know how to explain that they were tears of relief, fear, repressed desire, and a deep longing for something she had never had. It's been a long time since anyone touched me." Nathan tore her white shirt when he realized she couldn't take it off herself with her hands trembling so much. The sound of the fabric coming apart echoed through the empty warehouse, mixing with the crackling of the fire and the sound of both their heavy breathing. His touches were possessive, yes, but there was also a strange reverence, as if he were touching something sacred that he didn't deserve. The moment he took her, Rose smelled the scent that would haunt her for the rest of her life, red wine impregnated in his thick beard, mixed with the odor of rain that still wet his hair, burned wood from the fire, and the red earth of the valley that stuck to their sweaty skin. It was her first time, but Nathan wasn't gentle. He possessed her like a man hungry for something he couldn't even define. Not just sex, not just the goal of impregnating her, but something deeper and more desperate. When it was over, their bodies were covered in soot from the fire, sweat and red earth that had stuck to the blankets. Rose cried silently, her dirty hands gripping the rough boards of the floor, feeling a pain that was both physical and emotional. There was blood, which was expected, but there was also something more, a sensation of irreversible loss that hit her like a punch to the chest. Nathan didn't immediately withdraw from her. He stayed there, still breathing heavily against her neck, his body still trembling from something that seemed more like desperation than pleasure. She could feel his heart beating rapidly against her back, could hear low whispers in English and Spanish that she couldn't completely understand, but which sounded like pleas for forgiveness. "I need to do it again," he murmured after a few minutes, his voice hoarse and broken. "To be sure, to increase the chances." But there was something different in the way he spoke now, less clinical, more desperate. When he touched her for the second time, it was with a reverent slowness that violently contrasted with the previous urgency. This time Nathan was crying too, silent tears that fell on her neck as he moved slowly, as if each movement were a plea for forgiveness that he didn't know how to verbalize. His hands trembled when they caressed her face, when they pushed away the hair stuck with sweat, when they wiped his own tears mixed with hers. "I wasn't supposed to be feeling this," he whispered against her lips, his voice failing. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be just a transaction." But his touches contradicted his words. They were the touches of someone who was discovering something unexpected and frightening about himself. Rose couldn't respond because she was feeling the same thing, a deep and terrifying connection that shouldn't exist in such a sordid situation. It was as if years of loneliness and repressed desire were manifesting all at once, transforming what should have been a purely reproductive act into something intense and dangerous. When it all ended for the second time, they lay on the floor of the winery, covered by the dirty blankets, listening to the crackling of the fire that was beginning to die. The silence was heavy, laden with regret, and an unplanned intimacy that left them both uncomfortable. Nathan got up first, walked naked to where he had left his clothes, and she took the opportunity to observe his body in the firelight, the scars he had collected over the years, the small tattoo on his wrist that she didn't remember, the way he moved as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I need to leave," he said, putting on his pants without looking at her. "My flight to Zurich leaves tomorrow morning, and I can't be late." There was a new urgency in his voice, as if being away from her had become a matter of survival. Rose covered herself with one of the blankets and sat up, watching him dress. With mechanical movements. "What if it doesn't work? What if I don't get pregnant?" Nathan stopped with his shirt half on and looked at her for the first time since they had finished. His eyes were different, darker, more intense, with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Then I'll come back in 2 months after the surgery and we'll try again." The idea of going through that a second time made her stomach turn, but not from disgust or fear, from anticipation. And that realization frightened her deeply. "Nathan." "No," he interrupted her, finishing buttoning his shirt. "We can't talk about this. We can't feel this. It would be too dangerous for both of us." He walked to her and knelt, touching her face with a tenderness that contradicted his words. "You'll receive a bank transfer in 48 hours. Buy back the vineyard, renovate everything, live the life you always wanted. And if there's a baby, I'll never show up to complicate things." But there was an obvious lie in those words, so much so that Rose immediately perceived it. He wouldn't be able to stay away if she got pregnant. He wouldn't be able to live without knowing how the child was doing, how she was doing. What had happened there had changed something fundamental between them, created a bond that neither had anticipated. Nathan stood up, picked up his suitcase, and walked toward the door. He stopped when he got there without turning to look at her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost inaudible. "I'm sorry for everything, for the way it was, for the situation, for having to leave. But mostly I'm sorry because I liked it. I liked it too much, and that makes everything much more complicated." He left without waiting for an answer, and Rose heard the sound of the car starting, the wheels turning in the earth, the sound of the engine moving away until it became just a distant echo in the night of the valley. She stayed there, alone among the empty barrels and the ashes of the fire, feeling something dripping between her legs and knowing that her life would never be the same. The next morning, Rose woke up alone on the floor of the winery, covered by blankets that smelled of smoke, sweat, and something indefinable that made her remember Nathan with each breath. Her body ached in ways she didn't know, and when she stood up, she felt a dizziness that forced her to lean against one of the stone walls. The ashes of the fire were still warm, and there were bloodstains on the blankets that she carefully folded, not knowing why she was keeping them. She found a thick envelope left on the improvised table where Nathan had organized the medical equipment. Inside, besides an amount of money that made her choke with surprise, there was a handwritten letter and a new smartphone. His handwriting was elegant, slanted, typical of someone who had studied in expensive schools, but the words trembled slightly on the paper, as if he had difficulty writing. "Rose, I can't leave without trying to explain the inexplicable. What happened here was beyond anything I had planned or imagined. You touched me in a way I didn't know was possible, and that terrifies me more than losing my entire inheritance. I recorded a message on the phone. Listen to it when you're ready. I need to disappear before I change my mind and come back for you. Forgive me for everything." She sat for 3 hours on the wooden bench, holding the phone, before finding the courage to listen to the recording. When she finally pressed play, Nathan's voice filled the silence of the abandoned winery, hoarse and broken as she had never heard before. "Rose, I'm recording this at the airport waiting for the boarding to Zurich, and I can't stop crying. I haven't cried since I was a child, since my father taught me that Blackwell men don't show weakness. But you broke me in. A way I didn't know was possible. When I touched you, when I felt you surrendering despite all the fear, I realized that the worst punishment wouldn't be losing my inheritance. It would be never being able to love you as you deserve." His voice faltered, and she could hear airport noises in the background, people passing by, announcements in English. He continued after a few seconds, his breathing heavy and irregular. "I need you to know that I chose you not just because it was convenient. I chose you because I never managed to completely forget you. That honey-eyed girl who looked at me as if I was something special, when in fact you were always much better than me. Now I know I'll never be able to forget you, and that will kill me inside. But it's the price I have to pay for having transformed something sacred into a commercial transaction." Rose turned off the phone with trembling hands and cried until she had no more tears. Then she gathered her things, locked the winery, and returned to Los Angeles on the first bus she could catch in Santa Rosa. During the 6-hour journey, she looked out the window at the changing landscape from the dry valley to the coastal mountains, then to the urban expanse of Los Angeles, feeling that she was leaving behind more than just a place. 2 weeks later, the bank transfer arrived, exactly as Nathan had promised. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life, enough to buy the vineyard, completely renovate it, and still live comfortably for decades. But she couldn't touch the money. She would look at the bank statement and feel a mixture of gratitude and nausea that prevented her from making any decision. It was during this period that she began to feel the first symptoms. Morning sickness that she attributed to stress, sore breasts, an exacerbated emotional sensitivity that made her cry watching butter commercials on television. When she finally took the pharmacy test, alone in the tiny bathroom of the apartment, and saw the 2 pink lines appear clearly, she felt the world collapse and rebuild simultaneously. She was pregnant. The transaction had worked on the first attempt. The first impulse was to call Nathan, but she had no contact number for him besides WhatsApp, which had been deactivated since he left. The second impulse was to disappear, to go to some small town in the interior where nobody knew her, to have the baby far from any possibility of family drama or blackmail. But when she scheduled the first medical appointment, she discovered something that changed all her plans. "Congratulations, they're twins," said the gynecologist, showing the ultrasound screen with 2 little dots pulsing side by side. "But I need to be honest with you. It's a high-risk pregnancy. One of the embryos is implanted irregularly, very close to the uterine wall. We'll need to monitor closely." Rose left the office in a state of shock. Twins, high risk, Nathan somewhere, in Europe, not knowing that he had managed not just 1 heir but 2. And she alone about to face the most complicated pregnancy possible, with enough money to have the best medical care in the country, but with no one to hold her hand during moments of fear. It was during this time that she met Dr. Michael Bennett, The obstetrician who took her case due to the complexity of the pregnancy. He was kind, attentive, recently divorced, and began to treat her with a care that went beyond professional. In the weekly consultations, they talked about literature, viticulture, philosophy. He brought books to lend, asked about her academic. Research showed genuine interest in the person she was beyond the complicated patient. Slowly, almost without her noticing, Dr. Michael was falling in love with her. And she, starved for attention and care after months of loneliness and fear, began to correspond in a timid and confused way, not knowing if it was true love or just gratitude for having someone by her side during such a difficult period. Months passed in a routine of medical appointments, constant tests, and a growing anxiety that Rose tried to hide from everyone, especially from Dr. Michael, who had become more present in her life each week. He began to appear outside the office, bringing special vitamins, books about motherhood, organic fruits that he bought at a farmer's market near the hospital. His visits were always casual, but there was a clear intention behind each gesture. "You shouldn't be living alone in a high-risk pregnancy like this," he said on a Thursday afternoon, after a particularly tense consultation where they discovered that one of the babies was growing more slowly than the other. "You need someone to help you, to keep an eye on any sign of complication." Rose knew he was right, but the idea of sharing her intimacy with someone frightened her. She had gotten used to loneliness, to total control over her space and her emotions. More than that, there was a constant guilt gnawing at her inside, the feeling that she was betraying Nathan by accepting attention from another man, even though Nathan had made it clear that he would never return to complicate her life. "Michael, I can't," she began, but he interrupted her with a gentle smile. "I'm not asking for anything beyond caring for you and the babies. I'm a doctor, Rose. I know how to recognize when a patient needs emotional support as much as medical care." He touched her hand with delicacy. "Let me help, not as a doctor, but as a friend who cares a lot about you." The word friend sounded false to both of them, but she pretended not to notice. Michael was falling in love with her, that was obvious, and she was beginning to get used to the idea of having someone by her side, someone who treated her as if she were precious, fragile, worthy of care. It was the complete opposite of the way Nathan had treated her. He had possessed her as if she were something that belonged to him by right, while Michael courted her as if she were a gift he didn't deserve. In the 7th month of pregnancy, when her belly was already huge and the movements of the babies sometimes left her breathless, Michael finally confessed his feelings. They were in her apartment. He had made dinner because she could no longer stand for long periods, and after eating in comfortable silence, he knelt beside the armchair where she was reclining. "Rose, I know you're going through a difficult time, and I know I don't know your whole story, but I fell in love with you." His words came out rushed, nervous. "Not just with the brave woman you are, but with the babies too. I want to take care of all 3 of you. I want to be the father these children will need." She remained silent for a long time, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the babies move as if they were reacting to the conversation. Michael was a good man, stable, in love with her in a healthy and mature way. He offered exactly the kind of life she had always dreamed of: security, companionship, a true home for her children. "I can't give you what you deserve," she said finally, her voice low and tired. "My heart is complicated, hurt. Maybe I'll never be able to love someone in the pure way you deserve." Michael smiled and took her hand. "I'm not asking for your entire heart, Rose. I'm asking for a chance to win it, little by little. Let me prove that I can be the man you and the babies need." 2 weeks later, in a December dawn, Rose woke up with strong contractions and bleeding that deeply frightened her. Michael was sleeping on the couch. He had insisted on spending nights at her apartment in the last few weeks, worried about last-minute complications, and she called him in a trembling voice that immediately woke him up. "It's now," he said, already grabbing the maternity bag they had prepared weeks before. "I'll call the hospital, the surgical team. Everything will be fine, love." The word love came out naturally, without him thinking, and Rose realized that she wasn't bothered by it. Perhaps Michael really was winning her heart little by little, in a way she hadn't noticed. At the hospital, between the pains of contractions and the fear of losing the babies, she held onto Michael's hand as if he were her lifeline. He talked with the medical team with authority and competence, ensuring she had the best possible care, while whispering words of encouragement in her ear. "You're the strongest woman I know," he would say, kissing her sweaty forehead. "These babies are lucky to have you as their mother." But in the middle of the night, when the doctors finally decided they needed to do an emergency C-section due to the complicated positioning of the babies, Michael went out to make calls and organize the paperwork. It was then that the nurse approached with a worried expression. "Ms. Rose, there's a man at the reception asking for you. He says it's urgent, that he needs to talk to you before the surgery. He wouldn't give his name, but—" She hesitated. "He seems very desperate." Rose's heart stopped for an instant. There was only one person in the world who would appear at the hospital at that moment, at that hour, with that desperation. Nathan had returned. Rose felt the world spin around her. Between the contractions that came in increasingly intense waves and the shock of knowing that Nathan was there, at the hospital, after months of absolute silence, she could barely process reality. "No," she whispered to the nurse, trying to sit up on the stretcher. "He can't be here, not now." But before the nurse could respond, the door to the room opened, and Nathan entered like a storm. He was dressed in black, thinner than she, remembered, his face pale and his eyes sunken like someone who hadn't slept for weeks. There was stubble that made him look wilder, more desperate, and when he saw her on the stretcher, connected to monitors, with the huge belly marking the imminence of birth, tears sprang from his dark eyes. "My God," he murmured, approaching slowly as if he were in a church, and she were a sacred altar. "Rose, you are... they really are twins?" She couldn't answer, because a particularly strong contraction hit her at that moment, making her double over in pain and grip the hospital sheets with her fists. Nathan instinctively extended his hand to touch her, but stopped mid-movement, realizing that he no longer had the right to do so. "How did you know?" she managed to ask when the pain passed, her voice coming out hoarse and tired. "How did you find out where I was?" Nathan sat in the chair next to the stretcher, his hands trembling slightly. "I hired private investigators. Not to stalk you, I swear that wasn't the intention, but I couldn't live without knowing if you were okay, if you had gotten pregnant, if you needed anything." He ran his hands through his disheveled hair. "When I found out about the twins, about the high-risk pregnancy, I went crazy. I canceled all my commitments in Europe and came straight here." "You had no right," she said, but her voice came out weaker than she intended. Seeing him there, real and close after so many months, was stirring up emotions she had tried to bury. "You said you would disappear, that you would never show up to complicate things." "I know, and I tried, Rose. God knows how I tried." Nathan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her face. "But I couldn't. Each day away from you was hell. Each night I dreamed of that dawn at the winery, of the way you looked at me, of the sound of your breathing when—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I fell in love with you that night, and it ruined all my plans." Rose closed her eyes, trying to block the impact of his words. "It can't be love, Nathan. It was just sex, just a transaction that got out of control." "No," he said firmly, gently touching her hand. "It wasn't just sex. It was the first time in my life that I felt I was making love to someone, even in the most impossible circumstances." His voice grew lower, more intimate. "And by the twins, by the fact that you managed to get pregnant on the first attempt, I know you felt the same thing. Our bodies recognized each other in a way that had nothing to do with reproduction." A new contraction hit her, stronger than the previous ones, and this time Nathan didn't hesitate. He held her hand firmly, whispering words of encouragement in Spanish mixed with English, his voice choked with emotion. When the pain passed, he was crying openly. "They are mine," he said, touching her belly with reverence. "Ours. I can feel it, And you are mine too, even if you never want to admit it." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "I would do anything to have you back, Rose. Anything. Even if I have to destroy the world around you." It was at that moment that Dr. Michael returned to the room, carrying papers and talking on his cell phone with someone from the surgical team. When he saw Nathan there, holding Rose's hand, his face contracted in an expression of shock and something that looked like betrayal. "Who are you?" Michael asked, hanging up the phone and approaching the stretcher. "And what are you doing here?" Nathan rose slowly, and Rose noticed that he was a few inches taller than Michael, broader, with a presence that occupied the space in a dominant way. "I'm Nathan Blackwell," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more challenge than courtesy. "The father of the babies." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Michael looked at Rose with an expression of incredulity and hurt, then at Nathan, trying to process the information. "Father of the babies? But you said that—" "I never said there was no father," Rose interrupted him, her voice coming out firmer than she felt. "I just said it was complicated." Michael took a step back as if he had been slapped. "Complicated? Rose, I asked you to marry me. I offered to be the father of these children, and now the real father shows up at the time." "Of delivery?" "Dr. Bennett," Nathan intervened, his voice controlled but with a dangerous authority. "I appreciate the care you gave Rose during these months, but now I take over from here." "That's not how it works," Michael replied, the professional tone fighting against personal anger. "I'm the doctor responsible for her. I know the case, I know the complications. You can't just show up and—" Another contraction, the strongest yet, cut off the discussion. Rose screamed in pain, and immediately both men turned to her, the rivalry momentarily forgotten in the face of the medical emergency. Michael assumed his professional role, checking the monitors, while Nathan held her hand as if his life depended on it. "We need to take her to surgery now," Michael announced, already calling the team. "The smaller baby is in fetal distress." But when they began to move the stretcher to the surgical center, Nathan didn't let go of her hand, and Rose, between the pain and the fear of losing the babies, couldn't ask him to let go. The surgery lasted 3 tense hours. Nathan stayed outside the operating room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, refusing to sit down or accept anything the nurses offered. Michael was inside, leading the medical team with impressive professional competence. But every time he looked at Rose on the operating table, there was pain in his eyes that went far beyond medical concern. When the first baby cries echoed through the room, Nathan rested his forehead against the wall and cried silently. A few minutes later, he heard the second cry, weaker than the first, and knew that both had been born alive. A nurse came out of the room holding 2 small pink bundles, and when she passed him in the corridor, Nathan saw 2 pairs of dark eyes that were exactly like his. "They're 2 boys," she announced with a tired smile. "Small but healthy. The smaller one will need to stay in the neonatal ICU for a few days, but the prognosis is good." Nathan couldn't speak. He just stood there, looking at his sons through the glass of the nursery window, feeling an emotion he had never experienced before. It was love, but also terror, responsibility, a primitive desire to protect those tiny beings from everything bad in the world. It took Rose 2 hours to fully wake from the anesthesia. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Nathan sitting beside the bed, holding her hand, with eyes red from crying and an expression of relief that made her understand that he had thought of losing her during the surgery. "They're okay," he whispered before she could ask. "2 boys, small but perfect like you." She tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery prevented her. "I want to see them. I need to see them. I've already asked them to bring the bigger one. The smaller one is in the ICU, but only as a precaution. Tomorrow you'll be able to see him too." Nathan squeezed her hand. "Rose, they're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. They have your eyes, your mouth, but they have your stubbornness," she completed with a weak smile. "I felt that throughout the pregnancy. They were agitated, impatient, exactly like you. When they brought the first baby, Nathan held him with a gentleness that completely contrasted with his threatening appearance. His large, calloused hands, seemed enormous compared to the tiny body, but he held him as if he were made of crystal. "What should we name them?" he asked, and Rose noticed that he had said, "We, not you, Will." "Nathan," she said, tired, "we need to talk about this. About what happens now. About how this is going to work." He looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of the night at the winery. "I know what you're going to say. That I have no rights, that I can't just show up and claim all three of you. That you have a life built here. Have Michael who loves you and wants to take care of you." "Exactly," she confirmed, although her voice didn't sound as firm as she would like. "But I also have something to say," Nathan continued, returning the baby to the mobile crib and moving closer to her. "In the last few months, I've resolved all my family's problems. Jeremy is in jail, charged with human trafficking and rape. I got enough evidence to take him out of circulation forever. The inheritance is guaranteed, but more important than that, I realized I don't want that life anymore." Rose looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I sold a large part of the properties in Europe. I bought land here in California, in Sonoma Valley, close to your old vineyard. I want to start over. I want to build something new, something ours." He touched her face with delicacy. "I want to be the man that you and our sons deserve, not the problematic heir who appeared at your door desperate, but someone who consciously chose to stay." "Nathan." "I love you," he interrupted her. "I've loved you since that night at the winery, but it took me a while to understand that what I felt wasn't just sexual desperation or gratitude, it was recognition. My soul recognized yours, and that's why our bodies connected in that way. That's why you got pregnant with twins on the first attempt. That's why I couldn't stay away, even promising I would." Rose closed her eyes, feeling tears run down the sides of her face. "But what about Michael? He loves me too. He took care of me throughout the pregnancy. He deserves a woman who loves him completely," Nathan said softly. "And you deserve to be with someone who makes your heart race just by looking at you. Tell me that's not what happens when you see me." She couldn't answer because he was right. Even there in the hospital, after everything they had been through, just looking at Nathan, she felt that visceral connection that frightened and excited her at the same time. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to recover from the surgery. I need to take care of the babies. I need to think about all this calmly." Nathan nodded but didn't let go of her hand. "I'll wait. I'll stay here in Los Angeles. I'll help with the babies. I'll prove that. I can be the man you need. I won't pressure, I won't force anything, but I won't give up either." At that moment, Dr. Michael appeared at the door of the room, still wearing surgical scrubs, his face tired but professional. "How are you feeling?" he asked Rose, completely ignoring Nathan. "Better," she answered, sensing the tension in the air. "Michael, I need to thank you for everything, for the surgery, for the care, for—" "No need to thank me," he interrupted, with a sad smile. "It was my job, and it was a pleasure." He looked at Nathan, then back at her. "I understand the situation now. You have a history. You have children together. I can't compete with that." "Michael, it's not that simple," she began, but he shook his head. "Yes, it is, Rose, simpler than any of us would like to admit." He approached and kissed her forehead tenderly. "Be happy. All three of you deserve it." When Michael left, Nathan approached again. "He's a good man," he said, surprising her. "I almost hate him for that." And for the first time in months, Rose laughed, a low, tired laugh, but genuine. The surgery lasted 3 tense hours. Nathan stayed outside the operating room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, refusing to sit down or accept anything the nurses offered. Michael was inside, leading the medical team with impressive professional competence. But every time he looked at Rose on the operating table, there was pain in his eyes that went far beyond medical concern. When the first baby cries echoed through the room, Nathan rested his forehead against the wall and cried silently. A few minutes later he heard the second cry, weaker than the first, and knew that both had been born alive. A nurse came out of the room holding 2 small pink bundles, and when she passed him in the corridor, Nathan saw two pairs of dark eyes that were exactly like his. "They're two boys," she announced with a tired smile. "Small but healthy. The smaller one will need to stay in the neonatal ICU for a few days, but the prognosis is good." Nathan couldn't speak. He just stood there, looking at his sons through the glass of the nursery window, feeling an emotion he had never experienced before. It was love, but also terror, responsibility, a primitive desire to protect those tiny beings from everything bad in the world. It took Rose 2 hours to fully wake from the anesthesia. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Nathan sitting beside the bed, holding her hand, with eyes red from crying and an expression of relief that made her understand that he had thought of losing her during the surgery. "They're okay," he whispered before she could ask. "Two boys, small but perfect, like you." She tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery prevented her. "I want to see them. I need to see them." "I've already asked them to bring the bigger one. The smaller one is in the ICU, but only as a precaution. Tomorrow you'll be able to see him too." Nathan squeezed her hand. "Rose, they're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. They have your eyes, your mouth, but they have your stubbornness," she completed with a weak smile. "I felt that throughout the pregnancy. They were agitated, impatient, exactly like you. When they brought the first baby, Nathan held him with a gentleness that completely contrasted with his threatening appearance. His large, calloused hands seemed enormous compared to the tiny body, but he held him as if he were made of crystal. "What should we name them?" he asked, and Rose noticed that he had said "we," not "you will." "Nathan," she said, tired, "we need to talk about this, about what happens now, about how this is going to work." He looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of the night at the winery. "I know what you're going to say, that I have no rights, that I can't just show up and claim all three of you, that you have a life built here, have Michael who loves you and wants to take care of you." "Exactly," she confirmed, although her voice didn't sound as firm as she would like. "But I also have something to say," Nathan continued, returning the baby to the mobile crib and moving closer to her. "In the last few months, I've resolved all my family's problems. Jeremy is in jail, charged with human trafficking and rape. I got enough evidence to take him out of circulation forever. The inheritance is guaranteed, but more important than that, I realized I don't want that life anymore." Rose looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I sold a large part of the properties in Europe. I bought land here in California, in Sonoma Valley, close to your old vineyard. I want to start over. I want to build something new, something ours." He touched her face with delicacy. "I want to be the man that you and our sons deserve. Not the problematic heir who appeared at your door desperate, but someone who consciously chose to stay." "Nathan." "I love you," he interrupted her. "I've loved you since that night at the winery, but it took me a while to understand that what I felt wasn't just sexual desperation or gratitude. It was recognition. My soul recognized yours, and that's why our bodies connected in that way. That's why you got pregnant with twins on the first attempt. That's why I couldn't stay away, even promising I would." Rose closed her eyes, feeling tears run down the sides of her face. "But what about Michael? He loves me too. He took care of me throughout the pregnancy. He deserves a woman who loves him completely," Nathan said softly. "And you deserve to be with someone who makes your heart race just by looking at you. Tell me that's not what happens when you see me." She couldn't answer, because he was right. Even there in the hospital, after everything they had been through, just looking at Nathan, she felt that visceral connection that frightened and excited her at the same time. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to recover from the surgery. I need to take care of the babies. I need to think about all this calmly." Nathan nodded, but didn't let go of her hand. "I'll wait. I'll stay here in Los Angeles. I'll help with the babies. I'll prove that. I can be the man you need. I won't pressure, I won't force anything, but I won't give up either." At that moment, Dr. Michael appeared at the door of the room, still wearing surgical scrubs, his face tired but professional. "How are you feeling?" he asked Rose, completely ignoring Nathan. Better, she answered, sensing the tension in the air. Michael, I need to thank you for everything, for the surgery, for the care, for... No need to thank me, he interrupted, with a sad smile. It was my job, and it was a pleasure. He looked at Nathan, then back at her. I understand the situation now. You have a history, you have children together. I can't compete with that. Michael, it's not that simple, she began, but he shook his head. Yes, it is, Rose, simpler than any of us would like to admit. He approached and kissed her forehead tenderly. Be happy, all three of you deserve it. When Michael left, Nathan approached again. He's a good man, he said, surprising her. I almost hate him.